On a cold night in December 1773, a faint mist rolled over Boston Harbor. Beneath the silver light of a waning moon, a dozen small boats glided silently through the black water. The men aboard were not soldiers. They were carpenters, printers, blacksmiths, men of trade and toil, their hands rough with labor, their hearts pounding with something far greater than fear, the taste of freedom. They wore crude disguises, feathers, face paint, ragged blankets. To the world, they looked like Mohawk Indians, but everyone in Boston knew better. They were sons of liberty, men who had run out of patience with the king an ocean away. The ships in the harbor, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, waited like slumbering beasts, their bellies full of British tea. Each chest, sealed and stamped with the emblem of the East India Company, represented not just commerce, but control. When the first chest splashed into the icy water below, the sound was quiet, but carried like thunder through the night. It was a sound that would echo across continents and centuries, the beginning of the American Revolution. But the story of that rebellion, of how a collection of colonies turned into a nation, is not only about battles and declarations. It is about people, ordinary men and women who risked everything against the most powerful empire on earth. By the early 1770s, Britain ruled an empire that stretched across the globe, from India's jeweled coasts to the forests of North America. But power demanded money. Endless wars, especially the costly French and Indian War, had drained Britain's treasury. So, Parliament turned to the colonies to refill it. At first, the taxes seemed small: a penny on paper, a duty on sugar, a stamp on printed documents. But it wasn't the amount that burned the colonists, it was the principle. No taxation without representation, they cried. The words began as whispers in taverns and printing houses, but soon they thundered through every colony. Among those who felt the injustice most keenly was Samuel Adams, a failed brewer, a restless thinker, and a man who would become one of the Revolution's fiercest agitators. Adams saw the taxes as a weapon of domination. If we submit, he warned, we will be made slaves. In 1765, when the Stamp Act required every piece of legal paper to carry a royal seal, protests erupted. Effigies of tax collectors burned in the streets. Merchants boycotted British goods. The colonies, once divided by geography and religion, began to find common cause. Still, most colonists did not yet dream of independence. They wanted respect, not rebellion. But London refused to listen. Across the Atlantic, the British Parliament viewed the protests as childish tantrums. To them, the colonies were wayward children, rich, spoiled, and in need of discipline. So they sent soldiers to keep the peace. Boston became the beating heart of resistance and tension. Red-coated soldiers marched through its narrow streets, their boots clattering like drumbeats of occupation. Then, one freezing March night in 1770, tension ignited into bloodshed. A crowd of angry Bostonians surrounded a lone British sentry outside the customs house. Snowballs turned to stones, insults to threats. The sentry called for backup. Soon, a squad of soldiers faced the mob, muskets loaded. Someone, no one ever agreed who, shouted, "Fire!" When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead on the cobblestones. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a mixed-race sailor and former slave, the first man to die in the Revolution. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be called, was more than a tragedy. It was a spark. Samuel Adams and other patriots turned it into a rallying cry. Paul Revere etched the scene into an engraving that spread across the colonies like wildfire. For the first time, Americans began to see British rule not as paternal, but as tyranny. 3 years later, the tea ships arrived. When Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, it was meant to save the struggling East India Company by letting it sell tea directly to the colonies, cheaper even after taxes. But the colonists saw it differently, a trick to make them accept taxation without consent. On that December night, when 342 chests of tea sank into the harbor, Britain saw it as vandalism. The colonies saw it as defiance. London's response was swift and brutal. The coercive acts, or as Americans called them, the intolerable acts, closed Boston's port, dissolved its local government, and placed Massachusetts under military rule. It was meant to isolate Boston. Instead, it united the colonies. From Virginia to New York, from Pennsylvania to South Carolina, outrage spread. The cause of Boston, declared the Virginia Assembly, is the cause of us all. By 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, the first time Americans met to speak as one people. Among them were names that would echo through history: George Washington, John Adams, and Patrick Henry. "I am not a Virginian, but an American," Henry declared. They demanded that Britain repeal their intolerable acts, but King George III refused. The time of talk was ending. April 19, 1775, dawn broke over the village of Lexington, Massachusetts. A cold mist hung over the fields as a line of colonial militiamen, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, stood, trembling with their muskets. Before them, in gleaming formation, stood 700 British regulars under Major John Pitcairn. The British had marched all night from Boston, ordered to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. The militia was outnumbered 10-1. Captain John Parker turned to his men and whispered, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." No one knows who pulled the trigger. A single shot cracked the morning air, and the world changed forever. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead. The British marched on to Concord, where they were met by hundreds of armed patriots. This time, the colonists fought back, from behind trees, walls, and houses. By nightfall, the British retreat had turned into a desperate flight. The rebellion was now a revolution. News of the battles spread like lightning. Farmers left their plows, students left their books, merchants closed their shops, and all took up arms. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened. They faced a monumental question. Could they truly fight the might of the British Empire? They needed a leader, someone who could unite the colonies, command respect, and inspire courage. All eyes turned to a tall, quiet Virginian who sat near the back of the chamber: George Washington. He had fought bravely in the French and Indian War and carried himself with calm dignity. When John Adams nominated him as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, the vote was unanimous. Washington accepted the burden without fanfare. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he said humbly. But history had chosen him. The story continues through Washington's struggles, the turning points at Trenton and Saratoga, the secret French alliance, betrayal by Benedict Arnold, the harsh winter at Valley Forge, and the final triumph at Yorktown, weaving in the personal stories, secret missions, and human cost behind every victory. When George Washington rode north to take command of the Continental Army in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775, the soldiers he found were not the disciplined troops of a world power. They were farmers and fishermen, clothed in mismatched rags, armed with hunting muskets and pitchforks, their camps reeking of smoke and sickness. They were brave, but they were not soldiers. Still, when Washington arrived, towering, calm, dressed in his blue and buff Virginia uniform, something in the men stirred. They saw in him what they had never had before, a leader who believed in them. The British, entrenched in Boston under General William Howe, watched with scorn. To them, this army was a rabble, an untrained mob. Yet in that ragged assembly was something no British regiment could match, the fierce will of free men. For 11 months, the two armies faced each other. Washington built fortifications, trained his men, and waited for cannons. Those cannons arrived thanks to one of the war's first great feats of ingenuity. Henry Knox, a 25-year-old bookseller from Boston, led a team that hauled 59 massive artillery pieces over frozen rivers and snow-covered mountains from Fort Ticonderoga, a journey of more than 300 miles. When Washington positioned those guns on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor in March 1776, Howe awoke to find the American cannons staring down upon his fleet. The British evacuated Boston within days. The first great victory of the Revolution belonged to the Americans and to their untested commander. But Washington knew better than to celebrate too soon. He told his officers, "We must conquer or die." The fight for independence had only begun. By summer 1776, the air in Philadelphia crackled with tension and purpose. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, what we now call Independence Hall, 56 men debated whether to take the most dangerous step imaginable, to declare independence from the British crown. Among them was Thomas Jefferson, a tall, quiet Virginian of 33, chosen to draft the declaration that would change the world. Jefferson's pen poured out poetry and defiance. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. When the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, the bells of Philadelphia rang out in triumph. Yet outside that room, reality loomed dark. For as the ink dried, King George III was already dispatching the largest expeditionary force ever sent across the Atlantic: 32,000 soldiers, 10,000 sailors, and 400 ships to crush the rebellion. In August 1776, the British fleet darkened the waters off Staten Island. The thunder of their cannons shook the earth. Washington's army, now numbering around 20,000, faced annihilation. At the Battle of Long Island, the British outflanked the Americans under cover of night. The Patriots fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. Hundreds were killed, thousands captured. Washington, cornered against the East River, faced disaster. Then, in one of history's most miraculous escapes, a sudden fog rolled in on the night of August 29th. Under its cover, Washington silently ferried his entire army across the river to Manhattan. When the fog lifted at dawn, the British looked across the water to find the Americans gone. The retreat through New York was grim. Defeat followed defeat. Harlem Heights, White Plains, Fort Washington. By December, Washington's army had shrunk from 20,000 to less than 3,000. Many were shoeless, starving, and ready to give up. Thomas Paine, witnessing the despair, wrote words that reignited the fire. "These are the times that try men's souls." Winter came hard to New Jersey. The Delaware River froze at its edges, and British patrols roamed the countryside. Washington's army camped in silence on the Pennsylvania side. They had no food, no hope, but they had their commander, and he had a plan. On Christmas night, 1776, while the British celebrated in warmth, Washington gathered 2,400 men wrapped in rags, their muskets bound in cloth to muffle the sound. They crossed the icy Delaware River through sleet and snow. At dawn, they struck the unsuspecting Hessian garrison at Trenton. The battle lasted barely an hour. The Americans captured nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers, at the cost of only 2 of their own. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, outmaneuvering British forces and proving that the Continental Army was not finished. From the frozen banks of the Delaware, the Revolution was reborn. Every revolution needs its secrets and its spies. Among Washington's greatest weapons was intelligence. The Cooper spy ring, based in New York City, became the invisible hand of the war. Its members, ordinary citizens like Abraham Woodhull and Anna Strong, used invisible ink, coded letters, and laundry lines to pass messages. They uncovered troop movements, ship deployments, and even plots to assassinate Washington. One of their most important messages revealed a name that would become synonymous with betrayal: Benedict Arnold. Once one of Washington's bravest generals, Arnold felt underappreciated and resentful. In 1780, he conspired to hand over the strategic fort at West Point to the British in exchange for money and glory. The plot was discovered just in time. Arnold escaped, but his British contact, Major John Andre, was captured and hanged as a spy. Washington was crushed, but resolute. "Whom can we trust now?" he murmured. Yet the betrayal only hardened his will. The winter of 1777 to 78 at Valley Forge was the crucible of the Revolution. Snow blanketed the Pennsylvania hills as Washington's army, now numbering 12,000, built crude huts for shelter. Food was scarce, disease rampant. Horses died in the fields. Men boiled their own leather for broth. Yet out of that misery came unity. Washington wrote to Congress, pleading for supplies, his words seething with restrained fury. "You have no idea of the distress of this army." Help came not in the form of gold or grain, but in a Prussian soldier named Baron Friedrich von Steuben. A brilliant drill master, von Steuben spoke little English, but he had the fire of a teacher. He drilled the men day after day, teaching discipline, precision, and pride. He cursed in French, German, and broken English, and the men adored him for it. By spring, the army that emerged from Valley Forge was no longer a band of farmers. It was a trained fighting force. When they faced the British at Monmouth that June, the Americans held their ground. The enemy withdrew, and Washington's army stood tall under the blazing sun. The tide of the war was turning. Victory at Saratoga in 1777 had changed everything. The British general John Burgoyne, trapped in upstate New York, surrendered his entire army to American forces under Horatio Gates. The news electrified Europe. For the first time, foreign powers believed the Americans might actually win. In 1778, France, ancient enemy of Britain, officially recognized the United States and entered the war as its ally. French ships and soldiers, led by Marquis de Lafayette, joined the cause of liberty. Lafayette, barely 20 years old, became like a son to Washington. Together they dreamed of a new world, one where freedom was not a privilege, but a right. By 1780, Britain shifted its focus to the south, hoping to rally loyalists and cut off the rebellion's heart. Charleston fell. Savannah burned. American armies were crushed in open battle. Then came Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker turned general, whom Washington called the man of rarest courage. Greene did not fight to win battles, he fought to exhaust the enemy. He led the British on a brutal chase across the Carolinas, striking swiftly, retreating faster. At Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse, American tactics shattered British confidence. British commander Lord Cornwallis wrote bitterly, "I am quite tired of marching about the country in pursuit of men." By summer 1781, Cornwallis retreated north to Yorktown, Virginia, to rest and resupply. It would be the last move of his career. Washington saw his chance. With French General Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse, he devised a plan of breathtaking boldness, marched the Continental Army 400 miles south, secretly, while the French fleet blockaded Chesapeake Bay. The trap closed in October 1781. American and French forces bombarded Yorktown day and night. The sky lit with fire, drums thundered, the earth shook beneath the cannons. After 3 weeks, Cornwallis could hold no more. On October 19, 1781, his army of 8,000 surrendered. When the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," they were not wrong. Even after Yorktown, the war dragged on 2 more years. Skirmishes flared, diplomats bargained, and soldiers waited. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. George Washington returned to his farm at Mount Vernon, refusing the crown his countrymen would have given him. He said, "I am not only retired from the field, but from all public employments." Yet the legacy of what they had built, fragile, improbable, magnificent, endured. 13 colonies had become a nation. 2 centuries later, the echoes of those first shots at Lexington still live in the American heart. The Revolution was not just a war for territory, it was a war for ideas, liberty, equality, self-rule. It was fought not by kings or conquerors, but by ordinary men and women who refused to bow. They believed that freedom was worth everything, even the impossible. And because of them, the fire beneath the flag still burns. While men marched to war, the women of America waged battles of their own, not with rifles, but with resilience. In homes and fields, in hospitals and encampments, women kept the revolution alive. They spun homespun cloth when British goods were boycotted. They melted pewter plates into musket balls. They carried messages across enemy lines. And sometimes, when the fight came too close, they took up arms themselves. Abigail Adams, the sharp-minded wife of John Adams, wrote from her farm in Massachusetts, "Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." Her words were radical in a world ruled by men. She reminded her husband that liberty could not belong to one gender alone. Then there was Molly Pitcher, the name given to women who carried water to soldiers on the battlefield. At the Battle of Monmouth, legend says, one such woman saw her husband collapse at his cannon. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, loaded and fired, under blistering heat and enemy fire. There was also Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man, Robert Shirtliff, and enlisted in the Continental Army. She fought bravely for over a year before her identity was discovered, earning a pension for her service. And there was Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved African poet in Boston, who wrote words so powerful they reached the heart of George Washington himself. Her poems, filled with faith and fire, became part of the moral pulse of the Revolution. In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. Freedom, a word that meant different things to different people, but a word that united them all. The revolution preached liberty, but it was also shadowed by contradiction. More than 500,000 enslaved people lived in the colonies, and as men cried freedom or death, those in bondage listened with a bitter irony. For many, the war became a chance to claim their own liberty. When Lord Dunmore, the British governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation in 1775 offering freedom to any enslaved man who joined the British Army, thousands fled their masters to fight for the crown. They became known as the Black Loyalists, and they served bravely, digging trenches, carrying arms, and fighting in uniform for a promise of emancipation. On the other side, the Continental Army also saw Black soldiers rise. One of the most remarkable was Peter Salem, a former slave who fought at Bunker Hill and whose musket felled a British officer in the heat of battle. Another, James Armistead Lafayette, served as a double agent, feeding false intelligence to the British while secretly reporting to Washington. His spy work helped trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. When the war ended, Armistead gained his freedom. He added Lafayette to his name in honor of the French general who had supported his cause. Yet, for many others, freedom remained a dream deferred. The revolution had begun the conversation, but not finished it. In the new republic, slavery would linger like an unhealed wound, waiting for another war to finally tear it out by the root. The revolution was not only a war between Britain and America, it was also a civil war among native nations forced to choose sides in a conflict not their own. To many tribes, the British promised protection of their lands from encroaching settlers. The Iroquois Confederation, one of the most powerful alliances in North America, split apart over the decision. The Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, educated in Britain, sided with the crown, leading raids that devastated frontier settlements. Others, like the Oneida, sided with the Americans, hoping independence might mean fairer treatment. But after the war, most Native peoples found betrayal on all sides. The Treaty of Paris ignored them entirely, ceding their lands without their consent. Washington, though often respectful in private correspondence, saw westward expansion as destiny. By 1790, settlers were flooding into Ohio and Kentucky, and conflict with tribes resumed almost immediately. The revolution had promised freedom, but not for everyone. While soldiers fought on muddy fields, another war raged quietly in pamphlets, newspapers, and taverns, the war for hearts and minds. The printing press became the most dangerous weapon of all. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, sold over 500,000 copies, the rough equivalent of 75 million copies today. Its message was simple, searing, and impossible to ignore. "'Tis time to part." Paine wrote not for scholars or politicians, but for farmers, merchants, and artisans. He stripped away the mystique of monarchy and made rebellion sound like duty. Across the colonies, printers risked their lives to spread revolutionary ideas. British authorities burned presses, jailed editors, and confiscated papers, but the words kept coming. Each pamphlet, each essay, each letter became a spark in the tinderbox of revolution. And behind many of those presses were women and free blacks, unnamed, uncredited, but essential. Typesetters, binders, couriers. They were the unseen soldiers of the revolution's mind. Not every battle was fought with bullets. Some were fought with words, across polished tables and candlelit rooms far from the gunfire. Benjamin Franklin, America's elder statesman, became the revolution's magician abroad. In Paris, his charm and wit captivated the French court. He wore no powdered wig, no jewels, only plain American linen. To the French, he embodied the noble simplicity of the new republic. He played politics like chess, hinting, flattering, promising, until King Louis XVI finally signed the alliance that turned the tide of war. Meanwhile, John Adams battled in Europe for loans and recognition, writing home letters full of exhaustion and pride. "I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy," he wrote. And there was John Jay, the quiet architect of the peace negotiations. His steady diplomacy at the Treaty of Paris secured not just independence, but borders stretching to the Mississippi River, a breathtaking scope for the young nation. These men, as much as any soldier, carved America into existence. After the war ended, the euphoria faded into uncertainty. The country was free, but fragile. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at government, left the states squabbling like rival siblings. There was no executive, no power to tax, no standing army. The dream of unity threatened to dissolve into chaos. Then came 1787, and the gathering in Philadelphia once more. The same city where independence had been born now hosted a second revolution, the Constitutional Convention. Washington presided, silent but commanding. Franklin, now old and frail, whispered wisdom from the sidelines. Madison drafted, Hamilton argued, and compromise, painful, imperfect, became the glue of a new system. When the Constitution was finished, Franklin looked upon it and said, "A republic, if you can keep it." The revolution had birthed not just a nation, but an idea, one that would test itself again and again. Beyond the generals and founders were thousands who vanished into the pages of time. There were the camp followers, women and children who trudged behind the armies, cooking, washing, nursing, burying the dead. There were the deserters, broken by hunger and grief. The prisoners of war, starved in British prison hulks anchored in New York Harbor. More Americans died in those floating hells than on any battlefield. There were the loyalists too, nearly a fifth of the population who remained faithful to the crown. After the war, many fled to Canada, their homes seized, their lives shattered. They believed they had fought for law and stability. To them, the revolution was not liberation, but chaos. Every victory, every flag, every ideal carried a cost. The revolution's legacy did not end with the Treaty of Paris. It spread like wildfire across the world. In France, radicals studied America's example and arose against their own king. In Haiti, enslaved people heard whispers of liberty and ignited the world's first successful slave revolt. In Latin America, leaders like Simón Bolívar carried the spirit of 1776 in their hearts. Even in Britain, reformers began to question the divine right of kings. The fire beneath the flag had become a torch for the world. But America's own journey was only beginning. The new nation faced debt, division, and moral contradiction. The question that haunted Washington's generation, could liberty survive power, would echo through centuries. In December 1783, in the city of Annapolis, George Washington entered the Chamber of Congress to resign his commission. The war was over. The general had won everything and wanted nothing. Standing tall in his blue uniform, he bowed and said, "Having finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action and take my leave of all the employments of public life." When he left the room, even his enemies wept. King George III, upon hearing of Washington's resignation, said in astonishment, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." He did, and he was. Washington returned to his fields at Mount Vernon, a private citizen once more, proof that the Revolution had not merely replaced one king by another. The Revolution did not end in 1783. It still hasn't. Every generation since has wrestled with its promises: freedom, equality, self-determination. From the abolitionists of the 19th century to the suffragists of the 20th century, from the civil rights marchers to the dreamers of today, all have reached back to that first impossible moment when a handful of colonists dared to imagine a world ruled not by kings, but by conscience. The American Revolution was never just an event. It was and remains a question. What will we do with freedom? Epilogue: The Echo of the Drums. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind sweeps through the old fields of Concord or the cobbled streets of Boston, one might almost hear it: the faint roll of a drum, the creak of leather boots, the whisper of a flag in the dark. It is the sound of an unfinished dream, of courage, of failure, of hope. The men and women of 1776 were not saints. They were human, flawed, frightened, determined. They built something that has bent but never broken. And if you listen closely, across the centuries, you can still hear them say, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here."